Thank you very much, David, and thank you to David and Marcel for the kind invitation to join you all today. And I also would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which any and all of us sit in various places and various degrees of lockdown right now, and would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. To traceability, huge subject, really important, as you can tell from the presentations that we've had from Barry and Nerida and Matt already, and the conversation to date. There's a lot going on, and traceability has a really key role in that. So if we can move on to the next slide, in terms of sustainable packaging, I think one of the key things that we want to understand is everybody's mentioned the national packaging targets and the national waste policy plan. These are all really foundational and important pieces of work. And when we talk about it in the context of traceability, I think it's really useful to think about what does that mean for these targets, and when we're talking about that in the context of packaging specifically. So packaging, if you look at these 4 targets, it's really easy to think of the data and the information that's required to deliver on these as being about performance. But it really isn't. If you look at these 4 targets, that first one, the 100% of packaging to be reusable, recyclable or compostable, is really about the performance of the system. It's really about understanding, are we creating packaging that has the capacity to be reusable, recyclable or compostable? And so that's about a performance measure. Whereas you look at any one of these other 3 targets, and what you're really getting into there is the next level of not just data, but information. And that is really about measuring. That's where the traceability really comes into this, because you're actually now needing to not only identify and be able to recognize that something is reusable, recyclable or compostable, you're now looking to take it to the next level, and that is actually being able to trace those materials, trace the outputs that are coming from this work. And so if you're looking at something like phasing out problematic and unnecessary single-use plastic packaging, your first step is to identify what is that, and then there's a whole process that then has to happen about, well, now I've identified what it is, what are the alternatives, and working through all that. But then there's a whole monitoring and measuring kind of activity that has to go on to make sure that the progress is actually happening towards those targets. And that's really about tracing the outcomes. Nerida made some great points about, the changes in packaging and the packaging supply chain in the last 20 odd years. And what these targets have actually done is actually really put that evidence base into this work and given some real accountability for it. So anyone can make a commitment or a declaration and can say, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. What this actually does, and the process that we have established across the supply chain now, is actually monitoring those outputs. And that is actually where traceability is so important. And what becomes, even more important as you get into this work is understanding, how do you leverage technology to do that? Because this is really hard. It's people tend to want to simplify things, and I'm all for taking the big elephant and chunking it down into bite sizes, but the reality is this is actually really big and complex work. And Barry's doing a piece of work right now around soft plastics through the Product Stewardship Fund, and just the challenges of being able to get that material flow understanding, and then the stakeholders, and then who's doing what, and how's it happening, and is it happening, and is it effective, all really require this really strong traceability element. So the national packaging targets, yes, there's an element of performance in here that we're measuring to make sure that people are doing what they're saying they're doing, but in reality, without having effective traceability systems and developing up approaches that are going to work, we're really going to not be able to make this happen. So this is a really, really important conversation, and it's one that we've been having with GS1 and other stakeholders for some time. And when we're looking at traceability in this space, we're looking at things like material flows. We're looking to understand how is a product designed? How is it used? How is it created? Where does it end up? Where does it end up when it's either goes to landfill or it's collected and recovered and reprocessed? And where does it end up in that return market? So that whole life cycle is what we're trying to understand. And this is what Nerida was touching on when she was talking about, the key thing is, what's everybody else doing? Like, and this is where things like modern slavery and the traceability of that become really important, because it's not just about what you do when you hold it in your hand, it's where does it go after it's passed through your hands, and where did it come from before it got to you. And that visibility and that transparency is something that has not traditionally been available in the supply chain. And so there's been a lot of work done over the last couple of years, and frankly a lot more work that needs to be done going forward to increase that transparency. And beyond material flows, both Matt and Barry and Nerida all touched on the recycled content. It's a huge target that we're driving, and to drive that we actually really need to know, where did it come from, what did you do with it, and where did it go? And that requires a really big piece around traceability. But it's also, how do you then leverage technology to really go beyond? If this is, if we talk about, there's some performance measures in here, and that's one part of the job. And if you're trying to move beyond that to that next horizon, which is really about, well, not only measuring the system activity, but the traceability and the evidence that supports those measurements, what do you need to do that? So if we move to the next slide, let's just have a chat, if you like. And one of the reasons we wanted to bring up this subject today was to really get this group thinking about, well, where to from here, and how do we actually do this in a way, if we do have a complex issue that we need to resolve, how do we chunk that down, and how do we leverage things that are already happening in the marketplace? So one of the pieces of work that we've been working on with GS1 over the last year or so, and Marcel and his team, have been really looking to see what is the current data that we have available, what has APCO got, what's GS1 and others doing that we could possibly, collate or coalesce into some kind of platform that would enable us to be more efficient in doing that particular work. So we've worked closely to in our conversations with GS1, we all landed on the NPC, the National Product Catalogue, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, to really start to understand, well, how would that help with APCO's annual reporting requirements in terms of the data that brand organisations and manufacturers are required to collect or access to be able to feed back into the annual reporting process. So that was really our starting point. And from that, the conversation is now evolving into, how does that also support the 2025 targets? And if we look at the next slide, what we've done here, what we're trying to do is drive this collective impact towards those outcomes. And so when we talk about something like the national packaging targets, it's all about, how do we work together, and how do we work together as efficiently and effectively as we can. And so this slide here just gives you a brief overview of, you've got GS1 there, and what are they, what's their current capacity. And we looked at the NPC, and we see that as a really common foundation, and it's got a great framework, and it's up and running and active, which is great. And then you've got APCO, who are doing their work around the NEPM and the reporting requirements and the national packaging targets, and so are pulling together data and information points as well. And then we have our brand owners who are, implementing a range of these activities. And so how do we bring those three together? And so that was a part of some workshops that we ran towards the end of last year. And we looked at that and really looked at to see if we could define a set of variables that could align with the annual reporting process and support the national packaging targets. And there was a couple of key areas in those variables that were called out. So one was the sustainable packaging guidelines. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with that, that's actually a framework of a guideline framework that has 10 key principles about what you need to do to actually create sustainable packaging. And I think Nerida already referred to those. So there was that area that it could be a variable. Also, one of the ones that we've all touched on, recycled content. And this becomes really important because right now we are actually working through also how to do the recycled content in the ARL. So later on this year, we are launching the industry phase section of the ARL program for recycled content. So we've just spent the last year and a bit working through, what is the verification process? all those kind of points that Barry was touching on earlier. And we're just in the process of running various pilots right now to test that. But there will be a period of time which is about how do we make sure we've got that right, because, to Barry's point, it is really important that, industry and those organisations have confidence around the claims that they're making. So that's a really key part of working through that process. The other variables were recyclability, reuse, on-pack sustainability claims, and also, just enhancing and amplifying the overall transparency along the supply chain. So, even just in that kind of brief summary, there's some really big bits of work in that. And we think it's really valuable. And I think one of the important things here is that right now, over 70% of APCO members are also GS1 members. So, the ability to leverage something like the MPC is actually really valuable. And how do we do that? And how do we efficiently do that going forward? And most importantly, would that be valuable to organisations to have that capacity? It sounds like it, most people would assume that it would be, but this is kind of where we are now in terms of testing this. And I think, the work that we're doing through the ARL program around recycled content will also be really important to understand, well, how does that work, and can we leverage some of these existing platforms and actually amplify the technology and capability?